The galaxy had been engulfed in a brutal conflict for years, a war between several of its most advanced civilizations. What began as a dispute over resources had escalated into a full-scale war, dragging countless star systems into the fray. Entire planets were reduced to rubble, fleets obliterated, and billions of lives lost in battles that seemed to have no end. The conflict raged on, with neither side willing to back down, each convinced of their right to dominate the other. As the war dragged on, it became clear that this was not just a fight for control, but for survival. Amidst the chaos, humanity had remained notably absent. Known throughout the galaxy as fierce warriors, humans had earned a reputation for their strategic brilliance and unmatched resolve. But despite this, they were also known for their restraint. Humanity had learned the lessons of war over millennia and had adopted a policy of non-interference in conflicts that did not directly threaten their interests. They had built a prosperous civilization, isolated from the turmoil that plagued other parts of the galaxy. Their borders were well defended, their technology advanced, but they did not seek to expand their influence through conquest. This stance made them respected, but also feared. The galaxy knew that if humanity ever chose to enter a conflict, the outcome would be devastating for their enemies. As the war between the advanced civilizations reached a new level of intensity, a coalition of lesser-known species found themselves caught in the crossfire. These species, smaller and less powerful, had long been neutral, focusing on trade and peaceful coexistence. But now, their worlds were being ravaged, their people slaughtered as the larger powers fought over territory and resources. Desperate and with nowhere else to turn, the coalition made a bold decision. They would approach humanity, begging them to intervene and put an end to the war. The plea was met with mixed reactions on Earth. Humanity had long prided itself on its ability to stay out of unnecessary conflicts, focusing instead on its own development and the protection of its borders. The idea of intervening in a war that had nothing to do with them was met with skepticism by many. The human leadership, comprised of seasoned diplomats and military strategists, gathered to discuss the coalition's request. They understood the gravity of the situation, but they also knew the cost of war. Involvement would mean resources diverted, lives lost, and potentially long-term entanglements in the politics of the galaxy. The debates were intense. Some argued that humanity had a moral obligation to protect the innocent and end the suffering. Others pointed out the risks, warning that once humanity entered the conflict, there would be no turning back. They considered the potential consequences, both for their own people and for the galaxy at large. The decision was not one to be made lightly, and the weight of it bore heavily on those in power. Ultimately, the choice was made. Humanity would intervene, but on their terms. They would not enter the conflict as just another warring faction, but as enforcers of peace. Their goal would be to end the war, not to win it. The human leadership understood that their involvement would change the course of the conflict, and they were prepared to use their full might to impose a ceasefire. The decision was driven by a sense of duty, not to dominate, but to protect. They could no longer stand by while innocent lives were destroyed. The coalition's plea had been heard, and humanity would answer it. A task force was assembled, comprising the best humanity had to offer. Elite soldiers, diplomats, and strategists were chosen for the mission, each one fully aware of the importance of their role. Their objective was clear: end the war, restore order, and ensure that peace was maintained. The task force would not engage in prolonged battles, but would instead use their advanced technology and psychological warfare to force the warring factions into submission. Humanity had decided to act, but they would do so in a way that left no doubt about their intentions. With the decision made, preparations began. The task force would soon depart for the war zone, ready to impose peace on a galaxy that had forgotten its value. Humanity's involvement was no longer a question of if, but how. The message was clear: humanity had the power to end this conflict, and they would do so swiftly and decisively. The galaxy would soon learn that dragging humans into a war was a grave mistake, one that would not be repeated. The human task force, a finely tuned machine of diplomacy and military precision, was unlike any other in the galaxy. Composed of the best humanity had to offer, It included elite soldiers trained in unconventional warfare, diplomats versed in the art of negotiation and psychological manipulation, and strategists who had spent their careers studying conflict resolution on a galactic scale. This was not an army of brute force, but a calculated response team designed to impose peace through a combination of overwhelming technological superiority and strategic finesse. As the task force entered the war-torn sector, their arrival did not go unnoticed. Their ships, sleek and imposing, emerged from hyperspace with a precision that spoke volumes about the capabilities of those on board. The warring factions, embroiled in battles that had raged for months, found themselves momentarily united in a shared sense of unease. Humanity's reputation as fierce warriors preceded them, and their sudden appearance on the battlefield sent ripples of concern through the ranks of each faction. The leaders of these civilizations, who had dismissed humanity as a non-threat due to their previous neutrality, now faced the uncomfortable reality of human intervention. Upon arrival, the task force immediately began its work. They deployed reconnaissance drones, advanced AI-driven systems that rapidly gathered data on the ongoing conflict. These drones scoured the battlefield, mapping out enemy positions, identifying key players, and analyzing the complex web of alliances and enmities that had fueled the war. The human strategists quickly synthesized this information, understanding that the key to ending the conflict lay not in sheer firepower, but in unraveling the motivations and fears driving each side. Their approach was methodical, aimed at dismantling the conflict's very foundation without direct engagement. The task force's first public move was to establish safe zones for civilians, an act that was as much a demonstration of power as it was an act of mercy. Using technology far beyond what the warring factions possessed, they erected impenetrable energy barriers around designated areas, instantly creating sanctuaries where none had existed before. These safe zones were strategically placed to disrupt the ongoing battles, forcing the factions to either pull back or risk violating what was clearly a protected space. The message was unmistakable: humanity was here to protect, and they had the means to do so without interference. Within these zones, advanced medical units were deployed, providing aid to the wounded regardless of their allegiance. These units were accompanied by human diplomats, who moved among the refugees, gathering intelligence and spreading the word that peace was now on the table, but only on humanity's terms. The establishment of these zones was a calculated move, designed to win the hearts and minds of those caught in the conflict, while simultaneously applying pressure to the warring factions. It was clear that the humans were not just intervening, they were taking control. As the safe zones stabilized, human diplomats initiated contact with the leaders of the warring factions. These overtures were not requests for negotiation, they were statements of fact. Humanity had the power to end the conflict, and they were offering a way out that avoided further bloodshed. The terms were simple: immediate ceasefire, disarmament, and the establishment of a neutral zone overseen by the coalition of lesser-known species who had first sought humanity's help. The diplomats made it clear that these terms were non-negotiable. Refusal would result in consequences that, while left unspecified, were heavily implied by humanity's actions thus far. The initial responses were varied. Some leaders, recognizing the futility of continuing the war against such a formidable force, were quick to agree to the terms, seeing it as a way to save face and preserve what remained of their power. Others, driven by pride or desperation, hesitated, unsure whether to submit or resist. These leaders were reminded, quietly but firmly, that humanity had no interest in prolonging the conflict. The safe zones and their accompanying technologies were just the beginning, a taste of what humanity could bring to bear if the terms were rejected. Throughout this process, the human task force maintained a careful balance between diplomacy and intimidation. Every move they made was calculated to show that while humanity preferred peace, they were fully capable of imposing it through force if necessary. The safe zones, the aid provided to civilians, and the firm but reasonable demands for a ceasefire all served to reinforce the same message: humanity had the power to end the war, and they would do so on their terms. As the warring factions grappled with this new reality, the human strategists continued their work, identifying the key vulnerabilities in each side's defenses and leadership. They prepared contingency plans for every possible scenario, from outright refusal to deceptive compliance. The task force was ready to respond to any challenge, ensuring that no matter what the factions decided, the outcome would be the same: an end to the conflict and the imposition of a lasting peace. The presence of the human task force had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the war. No longer was it a contest of who could muster the most firepower or who could hold out the longest. Now, it was about survival in the face of an overwhelming force that had chosen not to conquer, but to pacify. The leaders of the warring factions were left with a choice: accept the terms offered and ensure the survival of their people, or resist and face the full might of a species that had mastered the art of war but chose, this time, to wield the power of peace. The human task force, having established its presence and set the stage for peace, now moved to exert pressure on the warring factions in a manner that left no room for doubt about the consequences of continued conflict. Their approach was methodical, rooted in an understanding of how to break the will to fight without ever engaging in direct combat. This was a war of attrition, but not in the traditional sense. It was a campaign designed to erode the very foundations of the war effort from within. The first phase involved strategic sabotage, executed with a precision that only humanity's advanced technology could achieve. Supply lines that had sustained the warring factions for months were systematically disrupted. Human operatives, using stealth drones and AI-guided systems, targeted key transport hubs, rendering them inoperable. Convoys carrying essential resources simply vanished, cut off by invisible forces. Food, fuel, and ammunition supplies dwindled, leaving soldiers on the front lines ill-equipped and uncertain. The disruption was so thorough that it became clear to the factions that these setbacks were not mere accidents but the result of a coordinated effort far beyond their capabilities. Simultaneously, the task force crippled the factions' communication networks. Using sophisticated electronic warfare tools, they intercepted and scrambled transmissions, sowing confusion among the ranks. Orders from high command were lost or altered, leading to chaos on the battlefield. Troops found themselves isolated, unable to receive reinforcements or supplies, while their leaders struggled to maintain control. The precision strikes on key military installations further deepened the chaos. Without a single life lost, the task force destroyed critical infrastructure, including command centers and weapons depots, leaving the factions blind and vulnerable. As the effects of these actions rippled through the factions, the situation on the ground grew increasingly dire. Resources that had once flowed freely were now scarce, and the impact on morale was immediate. Soldiers who had once fought with conviction began to question their leaders. Why were their supplies cut off? Why were their communications failing? And most importantly, why were they still fighting a war they were clearly losing? The internal dissent that followed was exactly what the human task force had intended. Leaders who had once commanded with authority now faced rebellion within their ranks, as the men and women under them lost faith in the war's purpose. Adding to the pressure, the task force unleashed a campaign of psychological warfare that further undermined the factions' resolve. Advanced AI systems were employed to craft and distribute propaganda tailored to each faction's weaknesses. Messages of despair and futility were broadcast across the galaxy, infiltrating every level of the factions' societies. The propaganda highlighted the hopelessness of their situation, painting a picture of inevitable defeat if the war continued. It emphasized the suffering of their people, the destruction of their worlds, and the utter futility of further resistance. These messages were not just words. They were delivered with images and footage of the devastation already wrought by the war, coupled with the chilling precision of humanity's recent actions. The psychological toll was profound. Soldiers who had once marched into battle with pride now hesitated, haunted by the possibility that they were fighting a losing cause. Civilians, already weary from years of conflict, began to protest, demanding that their leaders seek peace rather than continue a war they could not win. The leaders themselves, once so certain of their path, found their authority slipping away as doubt crept in. The task force had sown seeds of discord that began to flourish in the fertile ground of a population desperate for an end to the bloodshed. To reinforce the message, the humans conducted targeted demonstrations of their capabilities, acts of power so overwhelming that they left no doubt about the futility of continued resistance. In a series of coordinated strikes, entire fleets were neutralized within moments, reduced to nothing more than debris floating in space. Battlefronts that had been fiercely contested for months were silenced in seconds, as human forces dismantled enemy defenses with surgical precision. These demonstrations were not just about destruction, they were about showing the factions the sheer scale of what they were up against. The task force's actions made it clear that any further attempts at resistance would only lead to total annihilation. As the reality of their situation set in, the factions found themselves at a crossroads. They realized that the overwhelming force they faced was beyond anything they had encountered before. The once unthinkable option of surrender began to seem like the only viable path forward. However, pride and the fear of appearing weak before their rivals caused hesitation. Some leaders clung to the hope that they could still find a way out without capitulating entirely, while others secretly considered the human terms for peace but struggled with the shame of admitting defeat. This hesitation, however, was precisely what the human task force anticipated. They knew that the factions were on the brink of collapse, and they were prepared to push them over the edge. The relentless pressure applied by the humans had brought the war to a tipping point. The factions could either accept the peace on humanity's terms, preserving what little remained of their strength, or they could continue to resist and face the certainty of utter destruction. The task force had made it clear, the choice was theirs, but the outcome would be the same. Peace would be imposed, and humanity would ensure that this conflict ended once and for all. The warring factions, now mere shadows of their former might, found themselves with no choice but to agree to a ceasefire. Their forces had been systematically dismantled, their resources drained to the point of collapse, and their morale shattered. The relentless pressure from humanity's task force had left them with no viable path forward in the conflict. Reluctantly, the leaders of these factions convened to discuss the terms of their surrender, though they still clung to remnants of pride and fear. Human diplomats, calm and resolute, took the lead in these final negotiations. There was no room for debate or delay. The terms were laid out with clarity and precision: disarmament, reparations, and the creation of a neutral zone to be governed by the coalition of lesser-known species that had originally sought humanity's help. These terms were non-negotiable. The factions were to lay down their arms, dismantle their military infrastructures, and compensate the worlds they had devastated. The establishment of the neutral zone was to ensure that no single power could dominate the region again, providing a buffer that would prevent the resurgence of hostilities. The humans made it unequivocally clear that any violation of these terms would result in immediate and devastating consequences. They had demonstrated their capabilities throughout the conflict, and the factions knew that these were not idle threats. The human task force had the means to enforce the peace with overwhelming force if necessary. There would be no second chances, no room for maneuvering. The peace would be absolute, or the consequences would be catastrophic. To ensure compliance with the peace terms, humanity implemented a comprehensive enforcement mechanism. Surveillance satellites were deployed across the former war zones, equipped with AI-driven monitoring systems capable of detecting even the slightest hint of renewed aggression. These systems were programmed to respond instantly, relaying information to human forces who were prepared to intervene at a moment's notice. The factions understood that they were under constant watch, their every move scrutinized by a power that had proven itself far superior. The message was clear: any attempt to restart the conflict would be met with swift and decisive action. Despite their exhaustion and defeat, the factions' acceptance of the terms was tinged with reluctance. They had been beaten, not just militarily but psychologically, and the terms of peace felt like a bitter pill to swallow. Yet they knew that they had no other option. The ceasefire was declared, and for the first time in years, the galaxy experienced a moment of calm. The battle ceased, the weapons fell silent, and the war that had claimed so many lives came to an end. Relief washed over the galaxy, but it was a relief tempered by the knowledge of what had been required to achieve it. Even as the ceasefire took hold, there was an undercurrent of fear among the factions. They had seen what humanity was capable of, and they knew that the peace was fragile. The memory of their defeat, and the overwhelming force that had brought it about, lingered like a specter. The leaders of the factions, once so confident in their power, now faced the reality that any breach of the terms could bring humanity's wrath down upon them once more. The enforcement mechanisms were a constant reminder that the peace they had been forced to accept was not born of mutual understanding, but of necessity and the threat of annihilation. The human commander, the architect of this new order, broadcast a final message to the galaxy. The transmission was brief, but its impact was profound. Humanity, the commander stated, had intervened to restore peace, not to conquer. However, the galaxy should be under no illusion. This peace would be maintained by any means necessary. The commander's tone was measured, yet unyielding. Humanity preferred peace, but they would not hesitate to use their full might to enforce it. The war was over, and any future conflicts would be swiftly quashed before they could gain momentum. The commander's words resonated across the galaxy, a clear and unequivocal statement of intent. The factions understood that their era of unchecked power was over, and the rest of the galaxy watched with a mix of relief and apprehension. Humanity had stepped onto the galactic stage not as a conqueror, but as a peacekeeper, one with the capability and willingness to ensure that peace endured. The galaxy was left to contemplate the new balance of power, one in which humanity had become the ultimate arbiter of conflict. As the message concluded, the galaxy breathed a collective sigh of relief, yet the lingering fear remained. Peace had been achieved, but it was a peace underpinned by the knowledge that humanity's intervention could come again if needed. The factions, now disarmed and weakened, had no choice but to adhere to the terms, knowing that any deviation could bring about their complete destruction. The war was over, the ceasefire in effect, and the galaxy had entered a new era. Humanity's role as the enforcer of peace was now established, and the galaxy would have to adapt to this new reality. The finality of the commander's message left no room for doubt. Peace would be maintained, and humanity would ensure it, no matter the cost. The war that had seemed destined to consume the galaxy in endless violence had finally come to an abrupt end. Humanity's intervention, swift and unyielding, had achieved what many thought impossible: the cessation of a conflict that had spiraled beyond control. The factions, once locked in bitter and unrelenting war, now found themselves disarmed and bound by the terms humanity had set. The galaxy, scarred by years of destruction, began the slow process of recovery, but it was clear that the galaxy had been fundamentally altered by what had transpired. The lesser-known species, who had once been powerless spectators to the devastation, now played a pivotal role in the new order. Empowered by the terms of the peace agreement, they were tasked with governing the neutral zone, a buffer that humanity had created to prevent the resurgence of hostilities. This coalition, which had initially sought humanity's aid out of desperation, now found itself responsible for maintaining the delicate balance of peace. The shift in power dynamics was profound. These species, previously overlooked, now held significant influence in the post-war galaxy. Their role, however, was not without its challenges, as they navigated the complexities of governance under the ever-watchful eyes of humanity. Humanity's role in the galaxy had also been redefined. They were no longer the distant, neutral observers content to focus on their own affairs. Their actions had established them as the ultimate enforcers of peace, a position that came with both respect and fear. The methods they had employed, decisive, ruthless, and unyielding, left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the galaxy. While the war was over, the memory of how it had ended would linger for generations. Humanity's capability to impose order was now unquestionable, but so too was the cost of such peace. This imposed peace came with a price. The war had ended, but the fear of humanity's potential for violence now loomed large over the galaxy. The factions, once mighty and proud, were left humbled and wary, acutely aware that any future conflict could be met with an even more severe response. The unity that humanity had enforced was fragile, held together not by mutual agreement or reconciliation, but by the underlying threat of overwhelming force. The galaxy was unified, but it was a unity born out of fear rather than cooperation. This fragile peace, while preferable to the chaos of war, was still fraught with tension and uncertainty. The legacy of the war was one of caution. Species across the galaxy, whether involved in the conflict or not, were now more hesitant to engage in disputes. The knowledge that humanity could intervene, and with such devastating effectiveness, served as a powerful deterrent. The line between peacekeeping and domination had been drawn thin, and the galaxy knew that crossing it would invite consequences too severe to bear. Humanity's role as the ultimate arbiter of peace had created a new status quo, one in which the threat of their involvement was enough to maintain order, but at the cost of genuine trust among the galaxy's civilizations. As the galaxy moved forward, questions lingered about the future. Humanity had succeeded in imposing peace, but the long-term sustainability of this peace was uncertain. The fear that had kept the galaxy in check could just as easily give way to resentment or rebellion over time. The memory of the war's end, while a powerful deterrent, also carried the potential for backlash if not carefully managed. The peace humanity had enforced was stable, but not invulnerable. The potential for future conflict remained, lurking beneath the surface of the galaxy's tentative calm. The story of humanity's intervention closed with a contemplation of what lay ahead. The galaxy, forever changed by the events that had unfolded, would have to navigate this new reality with care. Humanity had ensured peace for now, but the question of how long this peace would last loomed large. The final thoughts centered on the delicate balance humanity had created, a peace held together by the promise of protection, but also by the implicit threat of force. The galaxy had been given a reprieve, but it was clear that this reprieve came with conditions. In the end, the narrative reinforced a simple yet profound truth. While humanity sought peace, they were prepared to impose it by any means necessary. The legacy of their actions would shape the galaxy for generations to come, a constant reminder that peace, though precious, often came at a cost. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: any who dared to challenge the peace humanity had established would face the full might of a force that had proven itself capable of ending even the most intractable of wars. The galaxy, now united in a fragile peace, would have to decide how to move forward, knowing that humanity's watchful presence was both its greatest protector and its most formidable threat.